Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Dynamics GP Workflow 2.0 webinar today. My name is Michael Bartnick. I'm from Software Solutions Group in Buffalo, New York. Today we're going to be going over a brief overview to get you started and give you some background on what exactly Workflow 2.0 is for Dynamics GP. I'm going to go over all of the different types of workflows you can set up, which is varies by version. As they've introduced new versions of Dynamics GP, they've provided additional types of workflows that you can use. I'll go over the prerequisites to get the technology side up and running to start setting up Workflow 2.0. We'll get into the setup. It's pretty basic stuff to start the setup and configure a workflow. Today's example will be using a PO requisition, and you'll see later on that PO requisition isn't the only place you can use workflow, but it's a place where we're going to start today. And we'll see that PO requisition in action, processing a transaction with it. So Workflow 2.0, it is, as you would expect, it gives you an approval routing feature into your Dynamics GP. So you can use that approval routing for purchasing approvals, is the most typical place where we see workflow set up. Although you can also use Workflow 2.0 not just for approvals, but for doing routine tasks. So if you have predefined tasks that you do when you set up a vendor, for example, you can set up those tasks in the workflow and have those set up according to your standard requirements and assign those to users to do. And those assignments are all email-based notifications. So GP users don't necessarily need to be set up for the approvers that you put into the workflow, because the approvals and tasks can be done or performed from just using your email that it goes into your inbox by clicking on hyperlinks that are included with Workflow 2.0. So again, those users, it ties to Active Directory, not the GP user. So if you have your Windows IDs already set up, that part is already done for you. The Workflow 2.0 is actually a replacement of the old workflow. It used Sharepoint, so there was additional overhead. You'd had to maintain a Sharepoint. Now workflow is all entirely just managed and maintained inside of the GP setup. And again, this is introduced in 2013. R2 is the version of Dynamics GP where it came out. And as we can see on the screen here, that when GP 2013 R2 came out, it just was introduced with purchase order approval, purchase requisition, and time cards and timesheets for payroll and project. As they introduced 2015, they added on general ledger approval, receivables approval, purchasing and payables and vendors, and a couple of additional ones in payroll and project. In 2015 R2, we have payables transactions approval, which is, I think, just want to point out, with payables transactions approval, what that means is you're approving one specific document, so you're approving an invoice, as opposed to the option in 2015 with payables batch approval, which is approving an entire batch of invoices. So GP workflow allows you to have any of the workflows turned on that you want, but the one caveat, the one catch with that, is you can't have payables batch approval and payables transaction approval turned on at the same time. It's one or the other for just those two options. So just the IT prerequisites to get you started, you have to have GP Web Services installed and configured. So you might need, if you don't have that set up in your GP or for your GP yet, you might just need to check with your IT to get that installed and configured. The next part is setting up the Active Directory users. So you probably already have your Active Directory user set up because you already have Windows accounts to get in to your computers, and those accounts have your emails tied to them. Now, one thing that's optional you might want to think about when you're thinking about workflow is you could set up Active Directory groups, which could work as workflow roles. And the reason you would do this is instead of saying in the workflow, assign this task or approval to Steve, you could say assign this to the finance approver. And Steve, when he's set up in Active Directory, gets assigned to that group. Or you could have multiple people assigned to a group. You could have a senior leadership group. So in your workflow, you could select either a user ID or a Active Directory group. It also helps with if there's turnover, you don't have to go back and take out Steve's name and put someone else's name in the workflow. So now we're going to get started with setting up Workflow 2.0. So there's only a couple screens to go through here. I'm going to pull up my GP, and I'm going to take you there so you can get there through, if you're going through the panels, from administration, the setup, open up system, and navigate into the bottom portion here for workflow setup. This is the screen it opens up. So you see up at the top, I have to put in my email server information. I'm using Office 365, so my server name is right here. It's going to be different for your organization depending on your Exchange server, what it is. And I have to fill in some authentication information. And at the bottom here, I'm checking this box to enable email actions. So what that does is that tells workflow that you're working with your web services and the name of that server that your IT would have installed that on. Throw that down here. So you might need just to have your IT get involved a little bit in this one in case you don't know the answers to these questions. But once you set it up, you can test to make sure that you did it correctly. If you do a test email action, you'll get this message right away that says your test succeeded if your web services are configured correctly. You can do a test email. So if I throw in my email address here in the to field, it'll send and click the send test email button. It tells me to go check my inbox to see if the email came to me. So I'll hit OK. I'll close the screen, and yep, I can see just popped into my email. There's an email from GP Workflow telling me I got a test, so that worked. And again, that's not the. You'll notice there's an option for workflow for SharePoint. You don't want to touch that. That's the old workflow. It's still available, but you're not going to be using that one. It's the workflow setup on this screen. So the next screen you might want to consider, and this is optional at this point, is a workflow calendar. So you can set and define working days for workflow. We'll see later on when we're talking about the configuration of the workflow that you can set up the approvals to have expiration dates or expiration times. The workflow calendar works along with that expiration because once a task or approval expires, you can set it up to automatically perform some type of action. That might be sending it to somebody else or rejecting the task. So this workflow calendar allows you to have a user put in a PO requisition, for example, at 4:30 on Friday, and not necessarily expire until Monday if you set it to 8 hours of expiration or till it expires because we've turned off Sunday and Saturday, and we have an end time on our day of 5 o'clock. So it's pretty self-explanatory. You can see from the screen. Also you can put in non-working days. So if you have holidays that you recognize, you can just type in the days, and those are not counted against in the workflow escalation process. So again, to get to that screen, you can use the drop downs or you can use the panels like I was showing earlier. So if I come and now go into the company section in the setup, in the administration setup, down at the bottom I have workflow. I select my workflow calendar, and here's the screen. Another thing you might set up, or which is actually it's still kind of optional at this point, is email messages. Workflow is already, when you install it, it comes with a bunch of predefined messages out of the box that pretty much get the job done on their own. But you can modify these messages or add messages if you want to add a little more detail or change the wording to the email that goes off to the approvers. So I have an example of one that I've created that's a little bit different. So the workflow email message setup is in that same area under workflow in the setup and administration. I'll open up the screen here and I'm going to pull up the message that I created. I just threw in my initials on there so I can identify it easy. So this is, I just took a copy of the standard message and created a new one, adding a couple of additional details. So you'll see that there's a bunch of plain text, and then every once in a while you'll see a field in here or a word in here that has brackets around it with some parentheses. What those represents are fields that are dynamically looking back into the database and grabbing information to throw it onto your email. So things like the requisition number, the who requested it, the document date, etc. So you can add these fields easily by just clicking onto your space on your document where you want to add it. You right click, hit insert, and you have your available fields list. So I can select, I can throw my document date on there, hit OK, and it fills it in. Another option is you can have your cursor where you want the field to go. Come down to the bottom section here where it says select and insert fields. Click the drop down and select the field you want to add and hit the insert button. I'm going to take that document amount out. Another thing to point out here on the select and insert fields is that we have document fields and workflow fields. Document fields, you'll see, are fields that are related to the PO requisition. That's the type of document I'm working with. Whereas workflow fields are related to specifically to the workflow. So there's a handful of things that are on here, such as the workflow comments, which we'll see when we submit a requisition. It prompts us to enter comments. Those comments will go onto the email because I've got that on my message, as well as workflow action list. So what we'll see later on is we'll have hyperlinks to approve and reject documents from the email message. Another cool little tip that I did onto this particular message, is I've added this document field lines, which when I do that, you'll see I'm in this body tab. It allows me to go to this document lines tab and select fields from the detail of the requisition document and add them as selected fields. So now in my email, where this document line fields shows up, I'll end up having a detail grid with the details of my requisition. So you can save that message and use it for later. So the last part of the setup of Workflow 2.0 is to configure the actual workflow. So the configuration lives in that same folder, so I'm going to take you there now. I've already set one up, and I'm going to go through the existing workflow that's already out there. When we create the workflow, we'll hit New Workflow first. So I'm not going to have that button available for me because we're looking at an existing one, which is in the Workflow Maintenance screen. I'm going to point out that all of the different series where workflow is available are available in this dropdown. So I'll select my purchasing because we're doing PO requisitions. And you see we have all of the payables, the POs, workflow types. So if I expand this option, you'll see I already have a workflow sitting there as an active workflow. One thing to point out too is that each workflow type, so purchase, requisition, vendor approvals, all of these have to have a manager, which is specific to them. The manager, the role there is basically in case the manager can edit the workflow, and also if there are approvals that have to get escalated to someone, some kind of top authority, there'll be that manager level top authority for it. So I'm going to go in to my workflow. So the first thing we have to do is we give the workflow a name and a description, and then we have a handful of options to set up, which are for this specific workflow. All of these options will apply. So I can first tell it what notifications I want to send for completed actions. So these are notifications that get sent to the originator. So on all these different steps that can happen to the PO requisition, whether or not I want to tell the person who put the requisition in that something happens. So I've got set up to tell them that it's been rejected or that it's been recalled. That what recalling is if someone's finally approved and then they need to make a change to it, they would recall it back into the workflow. Or also if it's been finally approved, we let the requisitioner know, and I'm also sending a carbon copy to someone else, which is myself in this example. The next option down here is whether or not we want to allow the approvers to delegate tasks. So we can delegate an approval to someone else if we're not sure if we want to approve it or not. We think that someone else needs to look at it. When the approval goes into the approver's inbox, they have an option to hit the delegation button and send it to any other Active Directory user. The third option down here is to allow an originator to be an approver. What that's going to do for you is if someone is, in our example of purchasing manager might submit requisitions but also be part of the approval process, that option lets them be part of that approval process and approve their own requisitions if it gets to them in the workflow process. We have an option to have at least one approver. So if we end up submitting a requisition that doesn't meet our criteria, which we're going to set up later, we can have it at least looked at by the manager that we talked about on the workflow type, which is back here. Back here. And then that use final alternate approver, that's if on the last step, if it gets escalated, we can say who it goes to, who that approval will go to. And then down at the bottom, we've got, as we were talking about with the workflow calendar before, we can have our approvals have an expiration on them. So when they do expire, we can take no action on it, and they just sit there forever until someone does an approval or rejection or a delegation on it. We can automatically escalate the document to the next person in line if there's multiple steps in our approval process. Or we can escalate it to a specific person who's in charge of just getting everything that's overdue. Or lastly, automatically just reject the overdue task. So now that we've gone through all of our workflow options and decided what we're going to do with the overdue tasks, we get to set up our steps. So with adding the steps, you need to name and describe each step and tell it whether if it's an approval or if it's a task. So if someone actually needs to sign off on it versus a task is we have to go tell someone to do something. And then the order of the steps. So we'll have, the way workflow works is we always have at least a first step, and then any subsequent step that we make would be a following step that follows that first step, or they follow one of the subsequent steps. You can have as many first steps as you want. Workflow is always going to check the first step and see if it needs to continue along on that path. So and then again, also after those first steps, you can have as many following subsequent steps as you need to meet your business's approval process. And so those steps all are going to have conditions assigned to them. So conditions can be kind of think of them as like a query that you build behind your step. So to show you that, and also who gets assigned to this step. So let's go back into our workflow. And so we've got a two-step process here. The first step is it's checking the account number. That's our first step. It's always going to run. It's always going to check the account number. And then if we find that the requisition is using a particular account number, we check the dollar limit. So we can see here that these are both approvals, obviously. And I have my condition, which I can expand this button or this condition screen by clicking this expansion button. And if I come to my conditions page, you'll see I have a little query here that says it's looking to see where the document amount is greater than $1,000. So out of the box, GP will have a bunch of fields available for you for the document or workflow type that you're working on. So we have requisition lines and requisition header fields, which we can build our query with. So if I wanted to change the amount, I can come in and hit this modify button. You'll see it fills in the top portion of the screen for me, and I can change it from $1,000 to $2,000 or $2,000 because we're increasing our approval limit, and hit update. Or I can add additional information to the query. So if it was if we cared to see who the requested by person was, we can add that to our query, and we'll say it contains Bartnick for me. If it's the requested by person is me. If I add that, you'll see it creates a bigger adds that line to the query, the condition. And so now that step would look and check to see if I created it and if it was over $1,000. If it was, it would say this workflow step needs approval from someone. Right now, I'm just going to take that last section out of it and click OK. And so we do that assignment down here after we've made our condition. So also, again, the conditions, we don't have to have a condition. We can always require this step to take place. So you can have a first step that always takes place, for example, and everything gets at least looked at by one person before it goes off, and you create more rules for it, for the workflow. So my assignment down here, again, these are Active Directory users. So if I click my lookup, I have people in groups. I can just start typing, and I could say I want Adam, and it's going to find Adam Martin. I can add him to the list. I can find Eric Jackson, add him to the list, and click OK. So you can see I can add more than one assigned user to the workflow task, and they're all going to get an email when it comes up, when this condition is met, that there's an approval waiting for them to take an action on it. And they'll have 8 hours to do so. So we can change that time limit. And again, this works with the workflow calendar. You see the checkbox down here. If we have that checked, it will use the workflow calendar that was set up earlier. So I can change from hours, days, or weeks and change the time limit. The message, the email that they receive in their inbox is going to be based off of what we enter in the send message option. So we could use I'm going to change that and use the one that I created earlier. And it's going to say, for our completion policy, does everyone need to respond or just one person? So we can just have, if I respond to it, the task is satisfied, versus majority of us, so 2 out of 3 got to do it, or we all have to respond and take an action on this approval task. So that's setting up the steps. A little bit of a helpful tip on setting up the conditions is that normally the condition editor kind of looks just like this screen. You wouldn't see the select fields, link tables, and run query. You just have this conditions with all of the predefined fields related to the requisition that GP gives you. a helpful tip is that you can enhance that condition editor by modifying the dex.ini file. If you throw a line in the dex.ini file that says query designer all functionality equals true, what that does is it changes the screen and allows you to select fields from the Dynamics GP database and link them to your requisition if that's the workflow you're working on. So as long as you can somehow figure out a way to link the field to a different table, you can really expand all of the different ways you create your conditions. You can get more fields than what's just available out of the box. So that's a little bit more of a tricky technical thing to do, but if you're familiar with database tables and and table relationships, it shouldn't be that difficult once you start getting into the tables. So now we're experts on setting up the configuration of the workflow. Before I forget, I want to go back to the workflow and just mention too that you'll need to make your workflow active. If you don't do that, then it's not going to do anything. There's no submission to make. So you have to make your workflow active to actually turn it on. That's a good way to, easy thing to forget is making the workflow active. So like I said before, the workflow, what it'll do is it'll send the documents into your inbox. So let's create just a sample purchase rec for today. So I'm going to come into purchasing, create a purchase requisition. You'll notice right away that there's this additional field submit and line at the top here. So I'm giving it a description, which is going to show in my email. I'm going to say that this was required by the end of the month. I'm just going to throw in some items from Fabricam and select my vendor. I can use user-defined fields. I'll add another line. You can see I can, because I'm using requisitions, it's not a purchase order yet, so it can have multiple, I can have different vendors on each requisition line. So I've got my requisition ready to submit. I'm happy with everything I have on here. I come up to the top, I hit the submit button. I say I can add comments to the requisition that's going to appear in the approver's email. So please approve soon. We need these by the end of the month. And click submit. And this is going to generate an email, which is going to go off to my inbox because I've set myself up as the approver on this specific workflow. The first step is checking to see what the account number is. So I've set as we were looking at earlier briefly, the account number segment. If it's 1300, it's going to find that document and send it for my approval. So I can see I just got that email in my inbox. So you can see I have, this is the message that we were looking at before. I have down here the detail because I had that I added the detail grid in my email previously when we set up the custom email. I have my comments from the requisitioner, and I have these hyperlinks. So if I'm a GP user, I can click the requisition hyperlink that drills me right back into the to the requisition. If I'm not a GP user, then that wouldn't work for me because I probably wouldn't have GP on my computer. So sometimes we see a lot of clients taking that off because the approvers aren't GP users. They're not going to go into GP, so why provide them something that's going to give them an error message if they don't have the program? or access. And then down below that, these hyperlinks those are the ones that they're going to use to approve, reject, and delegate. You'll see if they hit approve, they'll get this little box here that's kind of similar to the submission, the screen that came up when the user submitted it. So it has a space for comments where they can say comments that are going to go on the next email if the approval is going to go off to someone else. And they hit the approve button to send it off. They can also delegate. So if I hit the delegate button, the screen looks pretty similar, except for there's this one additional option here. So I can delegate at the top. It might be difficult to see on the screen. If I type in Adam, the Active Directory finds Adam Martin, and I can tell him, take a look at this for approval. This is a webinar, by the way, so he doesn't get too confused. I hit delegate, and it tells me my delegation's been submitted. Now, if I try and hit approve now, hit the approve now, it will come back and tell me that I've already done that. Well, it's supposed to. So I might be. Actually, you know what? I realized I think I'm clicking on the separate email. So now if I come back to my GP and find my requisition, you'll see it's now. I'm sorry. It's pending approval. I added. Oh, that's what I did. I added a couple of different users to the first step. So, yep, it's waiting for Adam Martin to take action on it. So it's pending his approval right now. So you have this workflow bar at the top to tell you what the current status is. So when he approves it, it'll go on to the next step to check the amount, and it'll find that it's less than $1,000, and it will be submitted. Now, if I'm a GP user, I can have a little queue in my GP homepage of all the approvals that require my my actions. So I can show you mine. So if you have different workflow types where you're an approver, if you're an important person that signs off on all that stuff, you'll see all of them in your workflow tasks. So I have payables, I have purchase orders, purchase requisition, vendor approval even, that are all waiting for me to take an action on it. And also you might have a question about, well, what about when someone goes on vacation or someone's sick and they're going to be away for a couple weeks? You can set up an automatic delegation for a period of time. So in the user preferences in GP, so if we go to the Dynamics GP user preferences, you have a workflow delegation button. When you open that up, you can see I've already set one up for my date well off into the future. And I have all of my different workflows, whatever they comes in. I'm going to be on vacation this week, so I'm delegating these to Adam Martin. And again, like we saw earlier when I pulled up the requisition, you can see the history. It audits any changes or delegations or rejections to the workflow. So if a workflow document got partway through the approval process, it got rejected by the approver and sent back to the originator. The originator could submit it and it'd go through the approval process again, and you would see all of the different sign-offs and any comments that were made on the requisition throughout the workflow process. And at the bottom here, we see that there's a concept of recalling in workflow. So if you make a change to a workflow document after it's been finally approved, gone through the entire process, and you have to change a price or you have to add an item to the document, you can recall it back into the workflow, and it will require you to resubmit, and it'll go through the workflow process to get that those changes approved. So, for example, if you're working on a PO as opposed to a PO requisition approval, you wouldn't be able to print the PO until it gets fully approved. So, if you make a change, recall it back in, and you don't resubmit it, it'll give you a message that says you have to resubmit this in order to print it because it's not approved. So that concludes our session today. Thank you for joining us, and please check our website for more recorded webinars.